Elena, Chapter 1. The Sound of Broken Things. The car door groaned, a rusty hinge complaining about the damp. It was the only sound. For now. Elena left the engine running, a low rumble against the suffocating quiet of the pines. She needed the noise. It was a flimsy shield against the silence her life had become, because silence had a way of echoing the things you wanted to forget. The air tasted of wet dirt and pine needles, a clean, sharp scent that should have felt like a fresh start. Instead, it just felt empty, like a room swept clean of everything that ever mattered. She'd driven for 2 days straight, fueled by black coffee and a fury so cold it felt like grief. She came to her grandmother's cabin seeking peace, but the quiet that greeted her felt more like an accusation. She finally killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was absolute, total. It pressed against her eardrums, magnifying the frantic beat of her own heart, a heart she was pretty sure was only beating out of habit. Her hand drifted to her left ring finger, tracing a pale, empty space. There was a ghost of a pressure there, the memory of a weight that had promised forever. What a joke. Forever had lasted until her maid of honor decided the groom looked better on her. The betrayal wasn't a clean cut. No, it was a slow, grinding shatter. The kind that leaves microscopic shards in your bloodstream, a constant ache you can't ever seem to locate. Her gaze drifted over the cabin. It was smaller than she remembered, a little hunched and weary, the wood weathered to the color of old bones. Just like her, she thought with a humorless smirk, worn down. This was supposed to be her escape, her anonymity, a place where no one knew her name, her story, or the hollow space where her future used to be. For that reason alone, she knew the trip was necessary. She stepped out of the car, her boots sinking into the soft, dark earth. A chill snaked up her spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. She wrapped her arms around herself, rubbing a small, crescent moon-shaped scar on her wrist. An old habit, a reminder of a different kind of fall, a different kind of pain. Some things never really leave you, do they? They just become a part of the landscape. She stared into the woods, into the deep, swallowing darkness between the trees. It felt like it was staring back, impassive, ancient, uncaring, good. She'd had enough of people caring. People's care came with conditions, with expectations, with the eventual, inevitable knife in the back. As she trudged up the porch steps, the wood sighing under her weight, she felt a profound sense of nothing. The numbness was a blessing, a thick blanket of fog that kept the real feelings at bay. She didn't want to feel. She couldn't afford to. Because if she started, she was terrified she might never be able to stop. The key felt cold and foreign in her hand, even though she'd worn it on a chain around her neck for years. It scraped in the lock. The sound was loud, obscene in the stillness. The cabin inside smelled of dust, wood smoke, and lavender, the ghost of her grandmother. It was a scent that used to mean safety, warmth, love. Now it just made the emptiness inside her feel bigger. A cavern where a home used to be. She dropped her keys on a small wooden table, the clatter echoing like a gunshot. She wouldn't unpack. Not yet. To unpack felt like staying, and she wasn't sure if she was staying or just pausing. Standing there in the gloom, surrounded by the ghosts of a happier time, a single hot tear finally escaped. It traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She swiped it away with an angry motion. No, not here. Not now. She would be strong. She would be numb. She would be alone. And it would be enough. Because it had to be. She would survive this. She would survive this because she had no other choice. She would stand on her own. She would rely on no one. And she would never, ever let someone get close enough to break her again. Just as that thought solidified in her mind, a new sound ripped through the quiet. It wasn't a creak of wood or a rustle of leaves. It was a howl, long and low and mournful. a sound of pure, gut-wrenching loneliness that vibrated through the floorboards and up into her bones. It wasn't the distant yip of a coyote. This was close, eerily close, and it was powerful. A mournful cry, a declaration of pain, a promise of violence all woven into one terrifying note. The sound wrapped around the little cabin and squeezed, and for the first time since she'd left the city, Elena felt something other than numb. She felt a primal, gut-clenching fear. The howl ended, but the sound of it remained, a chilling echo in the sudden, heavy silence that followed. And something deep inside her, something she didn't know was still there, felt an answering pull. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Pines. Following the unsettling quiet of the night before, Elena drove into the nearby town of Blackwood Creek with a defiant purpose. She needed milk and eggs, and to prove to herself that a scary noise in the dark wasn't going to send her running. The town was a single street of tired-looking buildings, nestled in the valley like a forgotten secret. Peeling paint, a rusted bell above the general store door, and the smell of sawdust. It was exactly the kind of place where everyone knew everything about everyone, exactly the kind of place she was trying to avoid. But her stomach rumbled, a traitor to her desire for isolation. She pushed open the door to the store, the little bell announcing her arrival with a cheerful, jarring jingle. An older woman behind the counter looked up from a crossword puzzle. Her hair was a cloud of white, her eyes a sharp, curious blue. "Well now, you're new." It wasn't a question. "Just visiting," Elena said, her voice tight. She grabbed a wire basket and moved down the aisle, intensely focused on a can of beans. She could feel the woman's gaze on her back, assessing, cataloging. "Staying up at the old Miller place, I bet," the woman called out. "Heard someone was heading to that cabin. Haven't seen anyone up there since Hazel passed." Elena flinched at the mention of her grandmother's name. "It was my grandmother's. Hazel was a good woman," the woman said, her voice softening. She came around the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm Marge. Knew your grandmother for 50 years. She offered a warm, wrinkled hand. Elena shook it reluctantly. Marge's grip was surprisingly strong. "You look just like her. Got that same stubborn set to your jaw." She leaned in a little, her voice dropping. "Hope you're careful, dear. Those woods, they aren't as quiet as they seem." The memory of the howl pricked at Elena's skin. She forced a shrug, aiming for casual. "Just some coyotes, I'm sure." Marge let out a short, dry laugh. "Honey, that ain't no coyote. Not what you hear up on that ridge, it's him." Elena raised an eyebrow, loading a carton of milk into her basket. Her sarcasm was her shield, and she raised it high. "Him? Is there a local boogeyman I should know about? Does he have a name?" Marge's smile vanished. Her expression became deadly serious, her blue eyes dark with a story she'd told 100 times. "We don't have a name for him. We just call him the Alpha. Lives up there in the deep woods. A beast, some say. Cursed." The word hung in the dusty air between them. Legend says he's a shifter, a man who becomes a wolf. And his curse, it's a bad one. They say he's fated to meet his mate, the one person meant for him. But the moment he claims her, the curse will twist him and he'll be forced to destroy her. Elena stared at her. It was absurd. A ghost story told to scare tourists. It had to be. And yet, the conviction in Marge's voice was chilling. It felt real because she believed it was real. "That's quite a story." "It's more than a story," Marge insisted, her voice a low murmur. "Things happen in those woods. People go missing. Livestock gets torn apart. Your grandmother, she knew the woods. She knew what to respect. She knew that some things are better left alone." That was the second open loop. What had her grandmother known? He's a shadow, a whisper, a bad dream waiting to happen. He wants to be left alone. and it's best for everyone if we do just that. Elena paid for her groceries, her mind reeling. She wanted to dismiss it, to laugh it off as small-town superstition. But the memory of that howl, the raw, aching loneliness in it, now seemed to have a story attached. A tragic, terrifying story. She muttered her goodbyes and hurried out of the store, the little bell mocking her with its cheerfulness. The fresh air didn't help. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger this time, an itch between her shoulder blades. She loaded the bags into her car, her movements quick, jerky. She told herself it was ridiculous. It was just a story. But as she slammed the car door shut, her eyes scanned the dense tree line at the edge of town. For a split second, a single, heart-stopping beat, she saw it. A shape. Not an animal. It was too tall, too broad in the shoulders. A dark silhouette standing in the deep shade of an ancient pine. It was perfectly still, a man-shaped piece of the forest's shadow. She blinked, and it was gone. Her breath hitched. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. Had she imagined it? Was the old woman's story getting to her? But the image was burned into her mind, the sheer presence of it. The feeling of eyes on her, intense, possessive, and impossibly golden, even from that distance. The engine roared to life as she sped away from the town, from the story, from the shadow. But she knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that she wasn't driving away from it at all. She was driving right back into its territory. Chapter 3. The Gold in the Gloom. Despite the old woman's warnings, Elena found herself pushing deeper into the woods a few days later. The feeling of being watched had faded to a dull thrum, a background noise she was learning to ignore. She told herself she was exploring, taking back her space. But really, she was running. Not from the woods, but from the four walls of the cabin and the memories trapped inside them. She needed to move. She needed the burn in her lungs and the ache in her legs. She needed to feel something other than the hollow ache in her chest. The path her grandmother had marked with small, faded ribbons had long since disappeared, but Elena kept going, propelled by a reckless energy. She was angry. At her ex, at her friend, at the world, and a little bit at herself for being so stupidly, hopelessly naive. The forest began to change. The friendly, sun-dappled pines gave way to a darker, more ancient part of the woods. The trees grew closer together, their branches tangling overhead, blotting out the sun. The air grew cold. The cheerful chirping of birds died away, replaced by an unnerving silence. A twig snapped behind her. She froze. Hello? Her voice sounded small, fragile. Silence answered. She turned, her heart starting a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. Probably just a deer. But she didn't believe it. She started walking faster, her boots slipping on the damp carpet of leaves. Another snap. Closer this time. To her left. Her head whipped around. Nothing. Just shadows. Panic, cold and sharp, began to build in her throat. She broke into a jog, then a run, crashing blindly through the undergrowth. A shadow moved, then two. Low, dark shapes keeping pace with her in the trees. She tripped on an exposed root, sprawling hard onto the forest floor. The impact knocked the wind out of her. Scrambling to her knees, she looked back. They stepped out of the shadows. 3 of them. Wolves. But not like any wolves she'd ever seen in a documentary. They were huge, their fur mangy and matted with burrs. Their ribs showed through their hides, but it was their eyes that stole her breath. They were intelligent, calculating, and filled with a vicious, starving cruelty. A low growl rumbled from the largest one's chest, its lips peeling back to reveal yellowed, terrifying fangs. They weren't just animals hunting, they were enjoying this. They were closing in, a tightening circle of teeth and hunger. This is it, she thought, a wave of impossible calm washing over her terror. This is how I die, alone in the woods. Suddenly, an explosion of motion from the trees behind them. It was a blur of pure black fury, a wolf, but bigger than the others, a monster of muscle and midnight fur. It slammed into the first wolf with the force of a freight train, the crack of bone echoing through the silent woods. Elena could only watch, paralyzed, as the black wolf moved with a brutal, terrifying efficiency. It was a whirlwind of claws and teeth. A snarl ripped through the air, a sound of pure, untamed rage that was 100 times more terrifying than the howl she'd heard before. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. In seconds, it was over. One wolf lay broken and still, the other two scrambling away, yelping in terror into the woods. Silence fell once more, thick and heavy, smelling of blood and fear. The massive black wolf stood over its kill, its chest heaving. It slowly turned its head, and its eyes. Its eyes found hers. They weren't the cruel, hungry eyes of the others. They were gold, molten gold. And they weren't the eyes of an animal. They were filled with a fierce, shocking intelligence, and a pain so deep it made her own heart ache in response. Time seemed to stop. The world narrowed to the space between them. She felt a jolt, a current of electricity that had nothing to do with fear. It was a pull, a soul-deep recognition that made no sense. It was as if a string she never knew existed had been tied from her chest to his, and it had just been pulled taut. As she watched, breathless, the wolf began to change. Bones cracked and reformed. Fur receded into skin. The monstrous form collapsed in on itself, reshaping with agonizing speed into the form of a man. He stood, naked, splattered with the blood of his enemy, his body a breathtaking landscape of lean muscle and scars. He was the shadow from the tree line, taller, broader, and more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. And his eyes, they were the same molten gold. He took a step toward her. The pull intensified, a dizzying magnetic force. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, guttural growl that vibrated in her very soul. "Leave this forest." It wasn't a warning, it was a command, a rejection, a dismissal so absolute it was like a physical blow. The hope, the flicker of connection she'd felt, was instantly extinguished. He turned his back on her, melting back into the shadows of the woods as if he were made of them. He was gone. Elena was left kneeling on the damp earth, trembling. Not from fear, not anymore. She was shaking from the shock of him, from the impossible, terrifying, beautiful thing she had just seen. She finally staggered to her feet and stumbled her way back in the direction of the cabin, but she couldn't escape him, because his scent, pine, wild musk, and something utterly, intoxicatingly male, was everywhere. It clung to her clothes. It was on her skin. It was in her lungs. And she knew, with a sinking, dreadful certainty, that she would never be able to wash it away. Elena. Chapter 4. The scent of danger sleep hadn't come easy since the man made of shadows and violence had saved her. In the 2 days that followed, Elena existed in a state of agitated haze. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw molten gold. Every time she breathed in, she smelled pine and wild musk, a ghost scent that had burrowed into her senses and refused to leave. She'd scrubbed her skin raw in the shower, but it was no use. He was imprinted on her, a terrifying brand on her memory. She tried to rationalize it, a hallucination, a trick of the light, a big dog and a crazy mountain man, but her heart, her very bones, knew the truth was something far stranger and far more dangerous. That was it. She couldn't stay. The decision struck her with the force of a physical blow. She came here to be alone, not to be haunted. She began to move with frantic energy, yanking clothes from the drawers her grandmother had used, shoving them haphazardly into her duffel bag. A photograph fell to the floor. Her and Liam, her ex-fiancé, smiling on a beach. So happy. So fake. A fresh wave of cold fury washed over her. She snatched the photo, ready to rip it to pieces, when a sound from outside froze her hand in midair. It wasn't the howl from before. This was different. Stealthier. the quiet, deliberate snap of a twig under a heavy boot. Her breath caught in her throat. She crept to the window, peering through a gap in the faded curtains. 2 men. They moved with a predatory grace that made the hairs on her arms stand up, circling the cabin from opposite directions. They weren't hikers. Their clothes were dark, their faces were hard, and their eyes. Even from a distance, she could see a feral glint in their eyes as they scanned the woods. They were hunting, and the cabin was the trap. She backed away from the window, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had to leave, not because of a ghost story, but because a real threat was right outside her door. Crack! The cabin door splintered, exploding inward off its hinges. Elena screamed, stumbling back as the 2 men filled the doorway. One grinned, a flash of white teeth in the gloom. "There she is," he purred. "Smells just like him, doesn't she?" They lunged. Time seemed to warp, stretching and slowing. But before they could take a third step, a blur of motion erupted from the side of the porch. It was him, the man from the woods. He moved with a speed that didn't seem human, slamming into the first man with a sickening thud that echoed in the small room. Elena could only watch in frozen terror as the scene unfolded. It wasn't a fight, it was a storm, a whirlwind of brutal, efficient motion. He ducked a wild swing, his fist connecting with the second man's jaw with a crack like stone on stone. There were no fancy moves, just raw power and a predator's perfect economy of violence. It was over in less than 10 seconds. Both men were down, groaning and unconscious. He stood over them, his chest heaving, his body a tense coil of lethal energy. He turned to her. His golden eyes blazed with a fury that wasn't directed at the intruders, but at her. Before she could speak, he crossed the room in 2 long strides and grabbed her arm. His touch was like a brand, a jolt of pure electricity that shot straight to her core. "Let go of me," she gasped, trying to wrench her arm free. His grip was like iron. "You can't stay here," he growled, his voice a low rumble of thunder. "Who were they? What do they want?" His eyes bored into hers. "They smelled my scent on you," he snarled, the words sharp and bitter. "They know you're tied to me. Now you're a target." He didn't wait for another question. He began to drag her out of the ruined cabin, out into the encroaching twilight of the woods. The world spun around her, a dizzying kaleidoscope of green and brown. The strange pull she'd felt before was back, but now it was 1,000 times stronger, a physical rope yanking her soul toward his. He must have felt it too, because he stopped suddenly, his grip tightening. He stared at her, his beautiful face a mask of pure agony and white-hot rage. "Don't you feel it?" he demanded, his voice cracking with a pain she didn't understand. "This connection? This curse?" He shoved her back against a tree, his body caging hers. "You're my mate." Chapter 5. The Cruelty of Hope. The word mate echoed in the suffocating darkness of the woods, stealing the air from Elena's lungs. It was impossible. A word from a crazy old woman's story. It couldn't be real. And yet, the undeniable pull, the jolt of recognition in his golden eyes, the way her entire body hummed with a strange energy just from being near him, it was all terrifyingly real. He dragged her through the forest, his grip relentless. She stumbled after him, her mind a chaotic storm of denial and fear. "Mate?" she choked out, tripping over a root. Like the story? The curse?" He didn't answer. He just kept moving, pulling her deeper into a part of the woods that felt older and wilder. The trees here were giants, their branches blocking out the sky. Finally, a structure emerged from the gloom, almost invisible against the mountainside. It wasn't a cabin. It was a house made of dark stone and heavy timber, a fortress built to keep the world out. He shoved her through the heavy wooden door into a large, cold room. A massive stone fireplace stood dark and empty. The furniture was sparse, heavy, and purely functional. There was no warmth here, no comfort. It was a beautiful, lonely prison. He released her arm and turned, his face shadowed and grim. She rubbed her wrist, the skin already bruising. The phantom heat of his touch remained. "I am not your mate," he said, his voice dangerously low, each word a carefully placed stone. "I will not be." He stalked toward her, his golden eyes filled with a self-loathing so profound it made her flinch. "The story you heard is true. I am cursed. And you will not suffer because of me." He stopped just before her, his presence overwhelming. She could smell the blood and the fight on him, mixed with that wild, intoxicating scent that was his alone. "I will not claim you. I will not condemn you. I will not destroy you." She stared at him, her heart hammering a painful rhythm. A tiny, stupid part of her had felt a flicker of hope when he'd said the word mate, a sense of belonging. The cruelty of that hope was a fresh, sharp pain on top of everything else. He looked her directly in the eye, his expression a mask of grim finality. "I, KL, Alpha of the Blackwood Pack," he began, the words formal, like an ancient vow. "Formally reject you, Elena." The moment the words left his mouth, a searing pain ripped through her chest. It was a fire, an invisible claw tearing her apart from the inside out. A gasp was torn from her lips and she doubled over, clutching at her heart. But she wasn't the only one. Cale let out a guttural cry, stumbling back as if he'd been shot. He slammed his hand against the stone mantel of the fireplace, his knuckles turning white, his whole body rigid with an agony that mirrored her own. He was in just as much pain. He had hurt himself to push her away. The devastation was so complete it left no room for anything but rage. Her own deep-seated fear of betrayal roared to life. This was just another version of it, wasn't it? Being thrown away, being told she wasn't wanted. Tears of fury and pain stung her eyes. "Fine," she spat, the word ragged and torn. "I don't want you. I don't want to belong to a monster anyway." It was a childish, pathetic lie, and the look in his eyes told her he knew it. For a split second, his cruel mask slipped and she saw a flash of raw, soul-deep agony. Then it was gone, replaced by a cold, impenetrable wall. He turned his back to her, his broad shoulders hiding his expression. "You will stay here until the rival pack that hunts me is dealt with," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Then you will leave this forest and never return." The finality of his words was more brutal than any physical blow. He left her standing alone in the center of the cold, dark room. The echo of his rejection was a raw, gaping wound inside her, and her body hummed with a pain and a desperate craving she couldn't possibly separate. Chapter 6. A Debt of Blood. For 2 days, the fortress was a silent prison. Elena saw Cale only as a fleeting shadow, a glimpse of his back as he disappeared down a hallway, the low murmur of his voice from behind a closed door. The tension was a living thing, a suffocating presence that made the air thick and hard to breathe. The pain of the rejection had dulled to a constant, heavy ache in her chest, a phantom limb that still throbbed. She refused to be a prisoner. She spent her time exploring the stone house, testing every door, every window, driven by a furious defiance. She had to get out because staying felt like a slow death, like accepting the cage he had put her in. On the 3rd day, she found it. A small, high window in a dusty storage room overlooking a steep, rocky cliff face. It was dangerous. It was stupid. It was perfect. Under the cover of dusk, she made her move. She climbed onto a stack of old crates, her fingers scrabbling for a hold on the cold stone. The window was narrow, but she was slender. With a grunt of effort, she wriggled through, scraping her side on the rough opening before dropping onto a narrow ledge outside. The wind whipped at her, cold and sharp. Below, the ground dropped away into a sea of dark pines. For a moment, vertigo threatened to pull her down. But the thought of escape, of freedom, was stronger. She began to inch her way along the ledge, her fingers and toes searching for purchase on the unforgiving rock. She was so focused on not falling that she didn't hear him until it was too late. A hand shot out from the shadows of an outcrop above, grabbing a fistful of her hair and yanking her backward. She cried out as her head slammed against the rock. A man dropped down onto the ledge in front of her, blocking her path. He wasn't one of the men from the cabin. He was leaner, faster, his eyes holding a snake-like malice. The Alpha's little pet decided to run, he hissed, a long, thin knife appearing in his hand. He'll be so sad when I bring you back to my master. In pieces. He lunged. Elena dodged, but the ledge was too narrow. The knife sliced across her forearm, a line of fire opening on her skin. She screamed, a raw, terrified sound that was ripped away by the wind. A roar answered her from inside the house, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury that was not entirely human. The window she had just escaped from shattered outward as Cale launched himself onto the ledge. But he wasn't just a man anymore. His eyes were glowing gold. His teeth had elongated into fangs, and thick black claws had erupted from his fingertips. He was a terrifying nightmare caught between man and beast. The attacker's eyes widened in fear, but he had no time to react. Kyle was on him, a whirlwind of primal rage. The fight was short, brutal, and ended with a sickening crunch as Kyle threw the man from the ledge into the darkness below. Kyle turned, still half-shifted, snarling, his chest heaving. The monster was still in his eyes. But then his gaze fell on Elena, on the blood dripping from her arm onto the stone, on her pale, shocked face. The beast in him receded. The claws shortened, the fangs disappeared. He was just Kyle again, but his eyes were wide with a panic that dwarfed her own. He rushed to her side, his hands hovering over her bleeding arm as if he were afraid to touch her. "You fool," he whispered, his voice ragged and full of a pain that wasn't his. "Did you think I was lying? They will not stop." He gently scooped her into his arms, his touch surprisingly careful. She was too weak, too cold and shaky to fight him. He held her against his chest, and she could feel the frantic, heavy thud of his heart against her ear. "This is why," he murmured, his voice thick with a torment she was just beginning to understand. "This is why you can't leave. Your life now depends on my protection." He carried her back through the broken window, into the prison she had just tried to escape. The world tilted, the sharp pain in her arm mixing with the dizzying, magnetic pull of his body so close to hers. She wanted answers. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to hate him for this impossible situation. But as she looked up at his face, etched with a grim torment that seemed to mirror the ache in her own soul, she realized the terrible truth. Her survival, her very life, was now completely tangled up with the one man who was cursed to destroy her. The forced proximity was no longer a threat, it was her only reality. Chapter 7. Rules of the Cage. The warmth of his arms was a confusing comfort against the biting cold of the night. Cale carried her back into the fortress, his steps sure and silent on the stone floors. He didn't handle her like a fragile thing. He held her like a priceless, volatile object he was terrified of dropping. He set her down in the main room, the cavernous space seeming even colder and emptier than before. The silence between them was a taut wire, thrumming with unspoken fear and a furious, unwilling awareness. She watched him, her mind a battlefield of warring emotions. Gratitude, sharp and undeniable, fought against a rising tide of fury. He had saved her life, only to drag her back to this beautiful, desolate prison. He finally broke the silence, his back still to her as he stoked the embers in the massive fireplace. "You will not leave this house again," he said. The voice was flat, devoid of the raw emotion from the ledge. It was the Alpha giving an order. Elena bristled, wrapping her good arm around herself. The pain in her other arm was a sharp, steady throb. "You can't keep me here." He turned slowly, his golden eyes catching the new light from the growing fire. They were ancient, weary, and held no room for argument. "I can, and I will, because it is the only way to keep you alive." The justification was simple, brutal, and infuriatingly logical. "There are rules now. You will not go near the windows after dark. You will not open the door to anyone. You will not try to run again." "Or what?" she shot back, her voice shaking with a mixture of pain and defiance. "You'll growl at me?" Chain me to the wall? I'm not one of your pack to be ordered around. A muscle feathered in his jaw. No, he said, his voice dangerously soft. You are not. You are the woman who bears my scent. You are a beacon to my enemies. And you are a liability I am now forced to protect. Each statement was a blow, stripping away her agency, reducing her to a problem he had to solve. He was a protector who resented his duty, and she was a prisoner who hated her savior. Your defiance is what almost got you killed. Learn from it. He gestured for her to follow, his movements stiff. I will show you where you can exist. He led her through the stone halls. The fortress was a contradiction. It was stark and masculine, but impeccably clean. A long wall in one hallway was lined with shelves crammed with old, leather-bound books. In another room, a massive oak table was covered with detailed, hand-drawn maps of the surrounding mountains and forests. It was the home of a recluse, a scholar, a king in exile. And everywhere, under the scent of old stone and wood smoke, was his scent. It was in the very air she breathed, a constant, invasive reminder of her captivity, and the terrifying pull he had on her. He made her feel like an intruder, trespassing not just in his home, but in the private corners of his soul. He stopped before a heavy wooden door and pushed it open. This will be yours. She expected a cell, a sparse, cold room. But the room he showed her was comfortable. A bed with a thick fur blanket, a small fireplace, already lit and crackling cheerfully, a worn armchair by the fire. It was a guest room. It was an act of kindness so unexpected it felt more disarming than his anger. It was a cage, but it was a gilded one. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Thank you, she whispered, the words feeling strange and inadequate on her tongue. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes avoiding hers. Do not mistake comfort for freedom. He backed out of the room, his gaze sweeping over her one last time, a complicated look she couldn't begin to decipher. Then he pulled the door shut. The heavy, final click of a lock sliding into place echoed in the quiet room. Elena stared at the door, her heart sinking. A prisoner and a patient, protected and caged. The two feelings warred within her, leaving her exhausted and more confused than ever. Chapter 8. The Heat of a Healer's Touch. Later that night, the throbbing in her arm had become a relentless, fiery drumbeat. The cut was deeper than she'd thought, and a feverish heat was spreading from the wound. She lay on the bed, curled on her side, a cold sweat beating on her forehead. Every pulse of her own blood was a fresh wave of agony. She had tried to sleep, but the pain was a sharp-toothed animal, gnawing at her, keeping her tethered to the miserable reality of her situation. She was trapped, she was injured, and she was utterly alone. A soft knock on the door made her jump. It was followed by the grating sound of the lock turning. Kyle stepped inside, and her breath caught in her throat. He carried a wooden bowl that steamed in the cool air, along with clean-looking cloths and a small pouch. His presence seemed to shrink the room, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. In the dim firelight, he looked less like a monster and more like something ancient and weary, a guardian burdened by a heavy, invisible weight. He looked hesitant, almost awkward. This was clearly not the alpha in his element. He was a creature of violence and command, not a caretaker. Your arm, he said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a question. He placed the bowl on the small table beside the bed. It needs to be cleaned properly. She wanted to refuse, to tell him to get out, to keep her pride intact. But a wave of dizziness washed over her as she tried to sit up, and she fell back against the pillows with a groan. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. She nodded weakly, extending her injured arm. He sat on the edge of the bed, a shocking, intimate proximity that made her skin tingle. The mattress dipped under his weight. He opened the pouch and the air filled with the sharp, earthy scent of herbs. It smelled of crushed leaves and damp soil and something wild she couldn't name. He dipped a cloth into the hot water, his large hands surprisingly gentle. "This will sting," he warned. When the cloth touched her skin, she hissed, a sharp intake of breath. The heat was a shock, but it was his touch that made her whole body go rigid. His calloused fingertips brushed against her skin as he carefully, methodically cleaned the gash. Every brief contact sent a little jolt through her system. He worked in silence, his focus absolute. She watched his face in the flickering light, the hard lines of his jaw, the faint scar that cut through one of his eyebrows, the way his dark lashes cast shadows on his cheekbones. He was beautiful. It was a terrifying, inconvenient truth. "Why did you run?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet, not looking up from his task. She didn't have an answer. Not a real one. "I don't do well in cages," she finally whispered. He paused, his golden eyes lifting to meet hers. "This is not a cage," he said, his gaze intense. "It is a sanctuary. There is a difference." He finished cleaning the wound and applied a dark, thick paste of the herbs. It was cool against her feverish skin, immediately soothing the fire. He then wrapped her arm in a clean bandage, his movements economical and precise. As he tied off the cloth, his thumb stroked unconsciously over the soft skin of her inner wrist just beside the bandage. It was a small, thoughtless, impossibly tender gesture. The air thickened, crackling with a sudden, palpable tension. The world narrowed to an inch of space between his thumb and her skin. He must have realized what he was doing at the same moment she did. He snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. The spell shattered. The cold, distant alpha slammed back into place. "Get some rest," he said, his voice rough and uneven. He stood abruptly and walked to the door without looking back. The lock clicked shut once more, plunging her back into solitude. But Elena was no longer alone. She was left with the ghost of his touch, a phantom heat that spread from her wrist all the way to her heart. Her anger at him was still there, a hot coal in her gut. But now, it was hopelessly tangled with a confusing, dangerous warmth. She hated him for trapping her, but her traitorous body was already craving the touch she knew she could never have. Chapter 9. A Poisoned Truth. The next morning, the lock on her door remained unturned. The silence stretched for hours, a new and special kind of torture. Elena paced the room like a caged animal, her mind replaying the moment of unexpected tenderness from the night before. His touch, the look in his eyes. It was a crack in his armor, a hint of the man beneath the monster. And it terrified her more than his anger did, because anger was simple. Tenderness. That was complicated. That was dangerous. That was how the hooks got in. Just as hunger began to gnaw at her, the lock finally turned. But the man who entered wasn't Kale. This man was younger, his build leaner than the alphas, his face handsome but shadowed by a deep, weary sadness in his hazel eyes. He moved quietly, holding a tray with a bowl of soup and a piece of bread. He offered her a small, hesitant smile. "I'm Liam," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm Kale's beta, his second. He asked me to bring you some food. He's busy." Elena remained wary, staying near the fireplace. An ally, or just another guard? Liam's sympathetic demeanor was disarming. "He locked you in," Liam stated, his gaze drifting to the heavy door. "I'm sorry. The alpha, he's not an easy man to be around, especially not with his curse." He set the tray down on the table, creating an us versus him atmosphere that Elena found herself leaning into. He felt safe. He felt normal. "The curse," Elena said, her voice barely a whisper. "The woman in town told me about it, that he's fated to destroy his mate." Liam's friendly expression darkened. He glanced nervously toward the door as if afraid of being overheard. He stepped closer. "Marge's story is what people in the village tell each other. It's not the whole story. It's tidier." "What's the real story?" Elena pressed, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. She was desperate for answers, for anything that would make sense of the monster with the healer's hands. Liam hesitated, his gaze full of a convincing, pained sincerity. "You have to understand," he started, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. "Cale carries a heavy burden. This isn't the first time this has happened." "Happened?" "The fated pull," Liam clarified. "You're not the first woman he was destined for." The words were a quiet bombshell. There was another. Her name was Annalise. It was years ago, before he became the alpha he is today. She was his mate. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Cale. He killed her. The curse twisted him, just like the legend says. On the very night he was supposed to complete the bond and claim her, he lost control. He tore her apart. The air left Elena's lungs. The room seemed to tilt. Annalise. A name. A ghost. It reframed everything. Cale's rejection, his pain, his self-loathing. It wasn't about protecting her from a vague, mystical danger. It was about protecting her from him, from what he had already done, from what he was capable of. He wasn't just a cursed man. He was a killer, a monster who had already destroyed the one person in the world who was made for him. Liam must have seen the horror on her face because he placed a comforting hand on her arm. She flinched away. "He regrets it more than anything," Liam said softly. "It broke him. It's why he's so harsh. It's why he locked himself away up here." He picked up the empty tray, his mission accomplished. He paused at the door, turning back to her with a final, chilling piece of advice. "Just be careful," he warned, his eyes full of pity. "His pain makes him unpredictable. He's not just your savior, Elena. He is the thing in this forest you should be most afraid of." He slipped out, leaving the door unlocked this time. Freedom. But Elena didn't move. The food sat on the table, untouched. The small, fragile warmth she had started to feel for Cale had been extinguished, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. She looked down at her bandaged arm, at the wound tended so carefully by the very same hands that had, according to Liam, torn another woman to pieces. Protector or predator? The question coiled in the pit of her stomach, a poisonous, terrifying hook. Chapter 10. The Blade's Edge. The almost kiss had shattered the fragile, icy peace between them. Now the silence was different. It was heavy, charged, filled with the ghost of a touch and the sharp, lingering sting of his rejection. Liam's story had planted a seed of ice in her heart, but Cale's moment of vulnerability had been a spark of warmth. Elena was torn between the terrifying man in the story and the tormented one she saw before her. She found him in a large, open room she hadn't seen before, its stone floor bare. He was sharpening a wickedly curved knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on whetstone the only sound. He didn't look up. "You are a weakness in my defense," he stated, his voice flat and cold. "My enemies know you are here. They will use you to get to me. Since you refuse to stay hidden, you will learn to fight." Elena's chin lifted. "You think I can fight one of those things?" "No," he said, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were hard, unreadable pools of gold. "I think you can learn to survive for 30 seconds longer. It might be enough time for me to get to you." The pragmatism was brutal, and she couldn't argue with it. Survival was a language she understood. She nodded. The training was a tense, unwilling dance. He started by placing a knife in her hand, his fingers wrapping around hers to adjust the grip. The heat of his hand, the rough texture of the calluses on his palm against the back of her own, sent a distracting jolt up her arm. "Like this," he murmured, his voice a low rumble so close to her ear it made her shiver. "Your grip is wrong. You'll break your wrist before you break skin." He moved behind her, his body a wall of warmth at her back, correcting her stance. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. could smell the clean, wild scent of him. It was intoxicating. It was terrifying. "Pay attention," he growled, sensing her distraction. "I'm trying," she bit out, her voice tight. She was trying to focus on his words, on the weight of the blade in her hand. But her body was acutely, painfully aware of his. Every brush of his arm, every low instruction spoken near her neck was a tiny spark on a field of dry tinder. This was torture. A slow, deliberate torture designed to remind her of everything she couldn't have. He moved to show her how to break a hold from behind. "An attacker will grab you like this," he said, his arms snaking around her waist, pulling her back flush against his chest. Her breath hitched. She could feel the solid, rhythmic thunder of his heart against her spine. It was a powerful, steady beat that seemed to calm the frantic fluttering of her own. "Feel for the weakness," he instructed, his voice now a rough whisper against her hair. "The pressure point. The joint." But she couldn't feel for anything. All her senses were consumed by him. The strength in the arms that held her, the heat of his body seeping into hers, the sheer, overwhelming presence of him. The lesson stopped. The air grew thick, heavy. Slowly, deliberately, he turned her in his arms to face him. His golden eyes were no longer hard and distant. They were dark, stormy, and filled with a raw, desperate desire that mirrored the ache in her own belly. He was going to kiss her. Her eyes fluttered shut in anticipation. Her lips parted. She could feel his breath, warm and uneven, against her skin. He made a sound, a low, guttural snarl of self-hatred. He shoved her away. Not hard, but the rejection was absolute. He stumbled back as if she were made of fire, his chest heaving. "Enough," he rasped, the word torn from his throat. The mask of the cold, controlled alpha was back, but she could see the cracks. She could see the agony it cost him. "The lesson is over." He stalked out of the room without another word, leaving her standing alone in the center of the cold stone floor. She was trembling, her whole body humming with a frustrated, aching energy. Her lips tingled with the ghost of a kiss that had never happened. A promise made and broken in the same searing, impossible moment. Chapter 11. The blood in the book. The almost kiss had shattered everything. Elena couldn't rest, her mind a frantic loop of his closeness and his immediate, violent recoil. Seeking a distraction, anything to quiet the noise in her head, she found herself drawn to the room with the books. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light filtering through a high window. She ran her fingers along the spines of the ancient, leather-bound volumes, searching for answers. For anything. Her fingers stopped on a small, dark red journal, its cover unmarked. It felt different from the others. Older. More personal. She pulled it from the shelf and sat in a dusty armchair, carefully opening the brittle cover. A dried, pressed flower fell from between the pages into her lap. It was a dark purple blossom she recognized with a jolt from her grandmother's garden guides. Wolfsbane. The handwriting inside was a spidery, elegant script, written by a woman's hand. An ancestor. Her heart began to beat faster. She started to read. The journal spoke of the Blackwood lands, of a pack of protectors, of men who carried the wolf inside them. It was a history. But then, the tone shifted. It spoke of a terrible betrayal centuries ago. A vengeful witch, spurned by the alpha of that time, had laid a curse upon his entire bloodline. The curse was specific, cruel, and absolute. Any alpha of his line would be driven by an uncontrollable bloodlust to kill his fated mate, the one person who could complete his soul. It was Liam's story, but older, more detailed. Elena felt a chill snake down her spine. But there was more. The witch had a sister, a healer who had loved the pack. In secret, she had woven a counterspell into the curse, a hidden thread of hope. A loophole. The journal described it in breathless, desperate detail. The curse could be broken. But it could only be broken by a mate who was also a direct descendant of the healer's own bloodline. The final piece of the incantation required an offering of blood from this special mate, freely given. The journal said the mark of this bloodline was a small, unique birthmark passed down through the generations. A tiny, perfect crescent moon shape. Elena froze. The world tilted on its axis. Slowly, she pushed up the sleeve of her sweater. There, on the pale skin of her inner wrist, was the shape she had known her whole life. The mark she'd always thought was a strange, faded scar from some forgotten childhood fall. It wasn't a scar. It was a crescent moon. She wasn't just his mate. She was the key. She was the weapon. The one person in all of existence who could either be his final victim or his only salvation. For a moment, she was breathless with the sheer impossible weight of it. Hope surged through her, fierce and bright, but it was immediately followed by a cold, sickening wave of suspicion. Betrayal. Had he known? Was this whole thing a setup? Had he brought her here, locked her away, not to protect her, but to use her? She felt like a pawn, a sacrificial lamb being led to an altar she hadn't known existed. The fear and confusion she'd been feeling hardened into a diamond-hard point of rage. She shot out of the chair, the journal clutched in her fist, and stormed through the fortress. She found him in the main room, staring into the fire. "Did you know?" she screamed, her voice cracking. She threw the journal onto the floor between them. It landed with a dull thud. He didn't flinch. She grabbed her wrist, shoving it in his face. "Did you know about this? Is this why you brought me here?" Kyle looked from the crescent moon on her wrist to the open journal on the floor, and all the color drained from his face. The look of genuine, soul-shattering shock that crossed his features was her answer. He hadn't known. But the shock was instantly replaced by a look of such utter, bottomless despair it stole her breath. "It doesn't matter," he whispered, his voice broken. "It only makes it worse." Before she could ask what he meant, a deep, resonant horn blast echoed through the stone walls, a mournful, urgent cry that vibrated in her bones. Chapter 12: The Beast and the Hand. The discovery in the journal had changed the very air between them, charging it with 1,000 new, unanswered questions. But the mournful cry of the horn had shattered the moment. Cale's head snapped up, his entire body going rigid. The despair in his eyes was instantly replaced by the hard, cold focus of a warrior. "They're here," he said, his voice a low growl. "A full assault." Chaos erupted. Shouts and snarling from outside the fortress walls confirmed his words. The rival pack was no longer sending scouts, they were laying siege. Kyle moved toward a heavy chest in the corner of the room, his movements fluid and lethally calm. "Go to your room. Lock the door. Do not come out no matter what you hear." "No," Elena said, the word leaving her lips before she'd even thought it. The woman who had wanted to run, who had tried to escape, was gone. In her place was someone who had just learned she might be the key to everything. "I'm not hiding." Cale's eyes flashed with anger, but he didn't have time to argue. A deafening crash echoed from the far end of the hall as the main gate splintered. The sounds of fighting, the wet tear of claws, the guttural shouts of men, the death yelps of wolves were suddenly inside. Kyle drew 2 wicked-looking axes from the chest and met the first wave of attackers as they flooded the hall. He was a whirlwind of controlled fury, his axes a blur of silver. But he was outnumbered. 3 of the rival wolves, massive and snarling, broke past the main fight and charged into the room. Kale roared, turning to meet them, but one was too fast. It lunged, its claws tearing a deep gash down his side. He cried out, a sound of both pain and fury as he slammed his axe into the creature. He was wounded, and the sight of his own blood, the searing pain, seemed to snap something inside him. He began to change. It was horrifying, his body contorted, his bones cracking and shifting under his skin, his features distorted, elongating into a half-formed muzzle. Claws tore through his fingertips. He was becoming the monster from the ledge, the terrifying hybrid of man and beast. A raw, uncontrolled snarl ripped from his throat, directed not just at the enemy, but at everything. His own pack members who had come to his aid backed away, their eyes wide with fear. He was losing himself. The curse was taking him. Liam appeared at her side, grabbing her arm. "Elena, run! Now!" But she couldn't move. She stared at Kale, at the raging beast, and saw the flicker of sheer terrified agony in his golden eyes. He was trapped in there, drowning in the rage. She remembered the journal. She remembered the connection. She remembered his hand, so gentle on her arm. Without thinking, she shook off Liam's hand and walked toward the monster. "Kale!" she shouted. The beast turned its glowing eyes on her, letting out a warning snarl that shook the very stones of the floor. It was a promise of death. "Don't come closer." But she did. She stopped just in front of him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Slowly, she lifted a trembling hand and placed it gently on his arm, on the tense, shifting muscle just below his shoulder. "Kyle," she whispered this time, "come back. It's me." The moment her skin touched his, a violent shudder racked his entire body. The snarling stopped, choked off in his throat. The monstrous features began to recede, the bones seeming to slide back into place. He looked down at her small hand on his arm, as if it were an anchor in a hurricane. Then he lifted his gaze to her face. The feral glow faded from his eyes, leaving only the familiar, tormented gold. He was breathing heavily, swaying on his feet, the deep wound in his side bleeding freely. But he was sane. He was him. He leaned on her, his weight a solid, grounding presence. In that moment, staring up at his vulnerable, pain-filled face, all her fear vanished. Liam's poisoned words, the ghost of Annalise, the very real danger surrounding them, it all faded into white noise. All that was left was the powerful, undeniable truth of their connection. He needed her. And a terrifying, thrilling realization dawned in the depths of her soul. She didn't want to run from him anymore. She wanted to stand with him. She wanted to fight. Chapter 13. An Alliance of Scars. The last of the attackers had been driven back into the woods, leaving a trail of blood and a ringing silence in their wake. Elena's hand was still on Kale's arm, a small point of contact in a world of chaos. He was leaning on her, his breathing ragged, the deep gash in his side a stark crimson slash against his dark shirt. For the first time, he didn't pull away from her touch. He needed it. The realization settled deep in her bones, a strange and powerful comfort. His pack members moved around them with a quiet, grim efficiency, tending to the wounded, securing the breached gate. But their eyes kept flicking toward her hand on their alpha. They were looks of shock, of confusion, and in some, a dawning respect. Liam approached them, his face a mask of concern. "Alpha, you're bleeding. We need to get you inside." Kyle finally seemed to gather his strength, straightening up and pulling away from Elena. The loss of contact was immediate and sharp, a sudden cold against her skin. "I'm fine," he growled, though a pained wince betrayed him. He turned to Elena, his expression hardening, his eyes once again building the wall between them. "Now you see," he said, his voice low and rough, gesturing vaguely at the blood-spattered stone floor. "This is the world you have stumbled into. This is the violence that follows me. You cannot stay here. When the sun rises, I will have one of my men take you far from here." It was his last, desperate attempt to protect her by pushing her away. A week ago, she would have leapt at the chance. But the woman who had run to this forest was not the woman standing here now. She looked at the wound in his side, at the weary exhaustion etched onto his face, at the torment he tried so hard to hide in his golden eyes. And she felt no fear, only a fierce, terrifying clarity. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it rang with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I saw you lose control, Kale, but I also saw you come back to me. I'm not running anymore." She took a step closer into his space, forcing him to meet her gaze. "That journal? It says I might be the key. Your salvation, not just your victim. So I'm staying." She lifted her chin. "We fight this. The rival pack, the curse, all of it, together." The air crackled with tension. He stared at her, really looked at her, searching for any hint of doubt. He found none. He saw the steel that had forged itself in her spine. He saw that she meant it. The fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a profound, weary surrender. It was a surrender not to her, but to a fate he had spent his entire life trying to outrun. "Fine," he finally breathed, the single word heavy with the weight of years of solitude and fear. It wasn't a victory. It was an armistice, a terrifying new beginning. They were no longer warden and prisoner. They were allies. From across the room, Elena saw Liam watching them. His handsome face was a mask of deep concern, but as his eyes met hers, something else flickered there. A coldness. A flicker of calculation that was gone as quickly as it appeared. A sudden, inexplicable unease went through her. His sympathy, which she had once clung to, now felt wrong. It felt like a performance. She pushed the feeling away, blaming it on the chaos of the night. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Chapter 14. The Edge of Surrender. The alliance was a fragile thing, a thread of unspoken promises woven through the thick tension of their days. In the week that followed the attack, the fortress was a hive of activity. They were preparing for a war, and for the first time, Elena was a part of it. She wasn't a liability anymore. She was a participant. She helped organize supplies, learn the names of the pack members, and spent long hours with Kale, poring over the maps in his study. This new proximity was different. It was collaborative. It was dangerous. Tonight, a storm raged outside, lashing rain against the thick windows and isolating the fortress from the rest of the world. It was late. The others were asleep. But she and Kale were still awake in the main room, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, a single lantern illuminating the map spread on the great oak table between them. The air was intimate and charged. "Marcus's pack is positioned here," Kyle said, his voice a low rumble, his finger tracing a line along a ridge on the map. "They have the high ground. It's a tactical advantage." Elena leaned closer to see, her arm brushing against his. The contact was electric, a small spark that lit a fire in her veins. She could smell the rain on him, mixed with his own wild, intoxicating scent. The bond between them, which had been a source of pain and confusion, was now a living entity in the quiet room, a low, constant hum of pure, agonizing desire. It was a craving. It was a hunger so profound it made her feel hollow. Her focus on the map dissolved. All she was aware of was him. The heat of his body, the strength in the hand resting so close to hers, the way the firelight carved his face into a breathtaking sculpture of light and shadow. "Are you afraid?" he asked suddenly, his voice soft. He wasn't looking at the map anymore. He was looking at her. She met his gaze, her heart skipping a beat. "Not of them," she whispered. The unspoken words hung in the air between them. "I'm afraid of this. I'm afraid of you." The tension finally snapped. He said her name, a prayer and a curse breathed into the space between them. "Elena." He moved, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones with a touch that was both rough and impossibly reverent, and then he kissed her. It was not a gentle exploration. It was an explosion, a desperate, hungry collision of all the pain, fear, and forbidden longing they had been forced to suppress. It was the howl in his soul meeting the ache in hers. He lifted her effortlessly, setting her on the edge of the table, scattering the maps of war to make way for a different kind of battle. The kiss deepened, turning raw and possessive. His hands roamed her body, learning her, claiming her. Her fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer. This was not about tenderness. It was about a desperate, soul-deep need. A growl rumbled in his chest, a primal sound of possession that sent a thrill of delicious fear through her. He moved to her neck, his lips hot against her skin, and she knew what was coming next. The bite, the mark, the final, irrevocable claim. She tilted her head, offering herself to him, ready to surrender, ready to face the curse, ready for anything. Bang, bang, bang! Loud, frantic pounding on the main door shattered the moment into a million pieces. Alpha! A panicked voice shouted from the other side. Kale, it's an emergency! Marcus's wolves! They've taken the Southern Patrol! Kale froze, his body rigid above hers. He tore himself away, a guttural snarl of pure frustration ripped from his throat. The desire in his eyes was instantly extinguished, replaced by the cold, hard steel of the Alpha. The world outside, the curse, his duty, it all rushed back in, a tidal wave of ice. He was once again the commander. She was left on the table, breathless, her body screaming with an unfulfilled ache, the taste of him still on her lips. She was utterly, agonizingly incomplete. Chapter 15. The Face of Betrayal. The fire had died to embers, and the searing heat of the moment had been replaced by a chilling, frantic cold. Kyle was gone, his voice a low, commanding rumble in the hallway as he organized a rescue party. Elena slid off the table, her legs unsteady. She pulled her clothes back into place, her body humming with a painful, frustrated energy. The ache of the interrupted claiming was a physical pain, a hollowness deep inside her. She felt more connected to him than ever and paradoxically more terrified. What if they had finished? What if that frantic pounding had been a second too late? Would the curse have taken him right there on the table? She needed to see him. She pulled a blanket around her shoulders and slipped out into the cold stone hallway, following the sound of voices down a flight of stairs to a lower level she'd never seen before. It was a command center, the walls covered in more detailed maps. She stayed in the shadows, not wanting to intrude. Kale stood over a table with two of his most trusted pack members. It was a perfect ambush, one of the men was saying, his face grim. Marcus's wolves were waiting for them. It's like they knew our patrol schedule down to the minute. Kale slammed a fist on the table, the sound echoing in the tense silence. Because they did, he growled, his voice laced with a cold fury. There is a traitor in this pack. Just as the chilling words left his mouth, Elena saw movement in a dark, adjoining corridor. It was Liam. He was alone, his back to the command center. He thought no one was watching. He pulled a small dark object from his pocket, a burner phone, sleek and modern and utterly out of place in this ancient fortress. He lifted it to his ear, his voice a low, urgent whisper that barely carried. Elena strained to hear, catching only a few terrifying words. Delayed, Liam whispered. The girl, a complication. She's getting too close to him. Yes, Marcus. The Alpha is vulnerable. He was wounded in the last attack. We strike at the full moon. He won't be strong enough to fight you and the curse. The world dropped out from under Elena's feet. Liam. Gentle, sympathetic Liam. The man who had warned her, who had comforted her, who had told her the tragic story of Annalise. It was all a lie. A calculated, cruel manipulation. He wasn't trying to protect her. He was using her to sow doubt, to weaken Kyle from the inside. The story that had haunted her, that had poisoned her view of Kyle. Was it even true? Or was it just another weapon in his arsenal of deceit? As if sensing her presence, Liam ended the call and turned. His eyes met Elena's across the shadowy hall. For a single, heart-stopping second, they stared at each other. The friendly, concerned mask he always wore dissolved, replaced by a look of pure, cold malice. He knew she had heard. She knew he was the traitor. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It wasn't a denial. It was a threat. Stay silent. Before she could find her voice to scream, before she could even process the full scope of his treachery, he melted back into the shadows and was gone. She was left alone in the dark, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was holding the most dangerous secret in the pack, and the traitor knew she had it. Chapter 16. The Serpent's Trap. The secret was a live coal in her throat, burning her, choking her. Liam was a traitor. The thought circled in her mind, a vulture waiting to land. Every shadow in the fortress seemed to lengthen, to twist into his friendly, lying face. She had to tell Cale. She had to warn him. But how? Cale had just left with the rescue party, a whirlwind of grim purpose and controlled fury. She was alone in the fortress with the rest of the pack, and one of them was a serpent. A cold, suffocating paranoia began to close in. Who could she trust? Who else was in on the betrayal? She was pacing the main hall, her mind racing, when a figure emerged from the corridor. It was Liam. Her blood ran cold. He stopped a few feet away from her, and the gentle, concerned mask he wore so well was gone. His eyes, which she had once thought kind, were now flat and cold as river stones. "You heard, didn't you?" he said, his voice quiet. There was no pretense, no denial. "In the hall. I saw you." Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, but she lifted her chin, refusing to show her fear. "What are you going to do? Kill me? It would look a little suspicious." A slow, chilling smile touched his lips. "No, I'm not going to hurt you." He took a step closer. "I'm going to take you to him. The rescue party. They were ambushed. It's a slaughter. Cale is losing control, Elena. He's turning. He needs you." He was using the truth against her, twisting her own power into a weapon. "Your touch is the only thing that can bring him back from the edge. We can use the old tunnels. It's faster." She didn't believe him, not for a second. It was a trap. But what choice did she have? If there was even a shred of a chance Cale was in danger, that he needed her, she had to take it. And staying here, alone with Liam, felt like a death sentence of its own. She gave a sharp, reluctant nod. This was a gamble, a desperate play in a game whose rules she was only just beginning to understand. He led her to a hidden door behind a tapestry, into a damp, narrow tunnel that smelled of wet earth and decay. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the small flashlight in Liam's hand. After several minutes of walking, a sliver of gray light appeared ahead. "This way," he urged. "We're close." The tunnel opened into a secluded clearing in the woods, far from the fortress. And they were not alone. A tall, charismatic man with dark hair and cruel, intelligent eyes stood waiting, flanked by a dozen of the most brutal-looking wolves Elena had ever seen. The man smiled, a flash of predatory white. This was Marcus, the rival alpha. "Liam," Marcus said, his voice like silk and poison. "You've done well." Liam gave Elena a slight shove forward into the clearing. "Here she is," Liam said, his voice devoid of all its previous warmth. "The key to breaking him." The trap had sprung. Marcus's gaze swept over Elena, a possessive, appraising look that made her skin crawl. He stepped forward and grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "The famous Elena," he murmured, his breath cool against her ear. "You have no idea how important you are, little bird." He looked back in the direction of the fortress, a triumphant smirk on his face. "Now, let the broken alpha come for his broken toy. Let him bleed. Let him break." He began to drag her away into the woods. She was a prisoner once more. But this time, her captor's goal wasn't to protect her. It was to use her as the bait, the lure, and the final, fatal weapon to destroy the man she was just beginning to realize she loved. Chapter 17. The Price of Salvation. The world had become a jarring, terrifying sequence of rough hands and snarling faces. Marcus's camp was nothing like Cale's fortress. It was a chaotic, muddy collection of tents and crude huts, smelling of unwashed bodies and spilled blood. The wolves here watched her with open hunger in their eyes. She was thrown into a small, filthy cage made of iron bars, the ground a cold, damp floor of packed earth. A wave of hopelessness so profound it was nauseating washed over her. An hour later, Marcus appeared outside her cell carrying a stool. He sat down, making himself comfortable, as if he had all the time in the world. "You're wondering why you're so important," he began, his tone conversational. "It's simple, really, a blood feud. Cale's father killed mine, an eye for an eye. But Cale, He's strong, honorable. His pack loves him. A straight fight is too risky. So you cheat, Elena spat, her voice trembling with rage. Marcus chuckled. I use the weapons I am given, and the curse is the greatest weapon of all. He leaned forward, his eyes glinting with a cruel light. I'm sure Liam told you the tragic story of Annalise. It was mostly true. But your friend Liam and that dusty old journal you found, they left out the most important part. He paused, savoring the moment. I did my own research. I found the witch's original grimoire. Your bloodline is the key, this is true, but the power needed to shatter a curse of that magnitude requires the ultimate price. A cold dread began to creep up Elena's spine. Your ancestors' counterspell wasn't just a clever trick, he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It was a trade, a life for a life. To break Kale's curse, you don't just have to offer a bit of your blood in some quaint ritual. You have to offer all of it, your entire life force. The ritual is designed to drain you, to use your unique energy to unravel the witch's magic. The good news is, it will save him. He smiled, a truly evil, soul-chilling expression. The bad news is, it will kill you. The words hit her like a physical blow. Kill her. The hope she had clung to, the idea that she was his salvation, was just a pretty mask for her own execution. It was an impossible choice. Let Kale suffer forever as a monster, or die to save him. The strength she had found, the purpose she had just claimed, all of it dissolved into a black, hopeless despair. She was shattered, utterly and completely broken. So you see, Marcus concluded, standing up and dusting off his hands. He looked down at her with a final, pitying smirk. Either way, I win. Either Kale dies on my wolf's claws trying to save you, consumed by his own beast, or he succeeds, and his grand victory costs him the one thing he just realized he cannot live without. You. He walked away, leaving her alone in the encroaching darkness. She was trapped in a cage, her body aching, her heart a gaping wound. But the iron bars were nothing compared to the prison of the choice he had just given her, a choice where every path led to ruin. Chapter 18. A heartbeat in the dark darkness and despair were her only companions. Time had lost all meaning. It could have been hours or a day. Elena lay curled on the cold earth of the cage, the numbness a welcome relief from the agony of Marcus's revelation. There was no hope of rescue. There was no hope for a future. There was nothing. Just the end, in one of two terrible forms. A distant commotion began to filter into her consciousness. Shouts, the sound of a desperate, furious fight, the savage snarls of wolves. It was a brief, brutal storm of violence. And then, silence. A figure stumbled out of the darkness, silhouetted against the dying fire of the camp. He staggered toward her cage. It was Kale. He was a nightmare. Blood soaked the front of his shirt, the wound in his side clearly reopened. His face was bruised and cut, his clothes torn to shreds. He had fought his way here, through Marcus's entire war party, alone. He looked half dead, but he had come for her. He collapsed against the bars of her cage, his strength finally giving out. He couldn't break them. He was too weak. Elena, he rasped, his voice a broken, painful thing. His golden eyes, usually so fierce, were filled with an agony that eclipsed every other pain she had ever witnessed. The curse was a visible poison in him now. Dark, thread-like veins pulsed beneath the pale skin of his neck and arms, a tangible manifestation of the beast devouring him from within. They told me, he choked out, his fingers weakly gripping the iron bars. When I captured one of them, he told me everything. Liam's betrayal, the price, that the ritual would kill you. He was not here as a rescuer. He was here as a supplicant. He had come not to break her out, but to break himself in front of her. Don't do it, he pleaded, his forehead pressing against the cold iron, his voice cracking with the effort of each word. Promise me, Elena. Let me die with this curse. Let me become the monster. Just live. His body shook with a racking sob. Live your life. Find someone else. Be happy. Just live without me. Please. He was offering to sacrifice his own soul, to endure an eternity of torment and self-loathing, just so that she could walk away and breathe. It was the ultimate, most selfless expression of love she had ever known, and hearing it, seeing this powerful, magnificent man so utterly broken for her sake, something inside her shifted. The black despair didn't vanish, but it was burned away by a sudden, brilliant flame of clarity. Marcus was wrong. The worst outcome wasn't dying for Cale. The only unbearable, truly impossible outcome was to accept his offer, to live a long, empty life in a world where he was suffering, and she had done nothing. She looked at him, this beautiful, broken man, and she knew. She would rather have one single, perfect moment of freeing him than an entire lifetime without him. The love she had been fighting against, the connection she had feared, was infinitely more powerful than her fear of death. She reached through the bars, her trembling fingers brushing against his blood-stained cheek. "Kyle," she said, her own voice surprisingly calm and steady. A single tear escaped and traced a silent path down her face. "I can't promise you that." Chapter 19. A vow forged in iron. Her words hung in the charged silence between them, not a rejection of his plea, but a vow. Cale stared at her through the iron bars, his broken expression slowly shifting to one of stunned disbelief. The finality in her voice, the quiet strength that had replaced her despair, was something he had never seen before. She was no longer a victim of fate. She was a woman who had just declared war on it. This moment of profound, heartbreaking connection was shattered by shouts from the edge of the camp. Figures moved through the trees, a blur of dark, efficient motion. Cale's pack. They had followed him. They fell upon the remnants of Marcus's forces with a disciplined fury that was a world away from the rival pack's chaotic brutality. The fight was swift and decisive. These wolves moved as one unit, their loyalty to their fallen alpha a tangible, lethal weapon. One of the warriors, a broad-shouldered man with a grizzled beard, reached her cage and shattered the lock with a single, powerful blow from an axe. The door swung open. She was free, but she didn't run. She walked straight to Cale, who was still slumped against the bars, his energy completely spent. "Get him up," she said, her voice commanding and clear. The warrior nodded, and together they hauled Cale to his feet, draping his arms over their shoulders. He was barely conscious, a dead weight of feverish muscle and unyielding will. He was a fallen king, and for the first time, she felt like a queen. She was no longer the person who needed saving. She was an active, essential part of his rescue. As they half-carried him away from the smoldering camp and back into the safety of the deep woods, he stirred. His head lolled to the side, his golden eyes finding hers, clouded with pain and a desperate anguish. "Elena, no," he whispered, his voice a threadbare rasp. "You can't." She met his gaze, her own unwavering and filled with a resolve that felt as ancient and unshakable as the mountains around them. "You didn't have a choice in this curse," she said, her voice soft but firm, for his ears only. "But I have a choice in how it ends, and I choose you, always." They made a temporary camp in a hidden cave behind a waterfall, a secret place known only to the pack. Cale's wound was deep and the curse was feeding on his weakness, the dark veins spreading across his skin like cracks in porcelain. The pack's healer, an old woman with eyes that had seen everything, shook her head grimly. "He's fading," she announced to the tense quiet of the cave. "The poison of the curse is winning. The wound will not heal while it has him in its grip." She looked directly at Elena. "The full moon is tomorrow night. It is the peak of the curse's power. It is when Marcus and the traitor will expect him to be at his weakest. It is our only chance." The clock was ticking, each second a grain of sand slipping away from Cale's life. Chapter 20. The weight of loyalty. The cave was a pocket of tense quiet, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and Cale's shallow, labored breaths. He lay on a bed of furs, lost in a fevered sleep. Elena found herself standing at the center of a council of war with the 3 remaining loyalists who had come on the rescue: the grizzled warrior, whose name was Gunnar, the healer, and a silent, deadly female wolf named Freya. They no longer looked at her as an outsider. They looked at her as the axle upon which their entire world now turned. "The healer is right," Gunnar said, his deep voice rumbling in the enclosed space. "We cannot beat Marcus in a straight battle, not with our numbers. Our only hope is to break the Alpha's curse, but the price—" He paused, his gaze heavy with the weight of his next words. He looked directly at Elena. "Are you certain you are willing to pay it? There is no coming back from this." Elena didn't flinch. The fear she should have felt was absent, burned away by the cold, clear flame of her purpose. "He was willing to suffer an eternity of torment just so I could live," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "How can I do any less for him?" She looked at each of them, her gaze connecting with theirs. Liam and Marcus are counting on him being weak. They're counting on him being consumed by the curse. They are counting on him being alone. A fierce, protective energy surged through her. "They're wrong. He has me. And he has you." A new strength settled in her, the strength of a leader, of a Luna. "We will not fight for revenge. We will not fight for territory. We will fight for him, for our Alpha, for our future." The plan they formed was desperate and bold. Marcus would be expecting them at the place of the curse's origin, an ancient stone circle high in the mountains. He would use the power of the full moon and the sacred place to finish Cale. They would use it to save him. Gunnar and the rest of the pack would create a diversion, a false attack on Marcus's main camp to draw away the bulk of his forces. Meanwhile, Elena, Freya, and the healer would take Cale to the stone circle. A low groan came from the bed of furs. Cale was awake, struggling to push himself up. He had heard. His golden eyes, glazed with fever, burned with the last embers of his alpha fire. "No," he rasped, his voice a shred of its former power. "I forbid it. She will not be sacrificed." His pack was torn, their loyalty to his command warring with the desperate need to save his life. The tension was unbearable. Elena walked over to him, kneeling by his side. She took his hand, his skin burning against hers. She looked at him not with pity, but with the unwavering strength of an equal. "It's not your decision to make anymore, Cale," she said softly, but her voice held a core of unbreakable steel. "It's mine, and I have already made my choice." His pack looked from their dying alpha to the woman who held his hand, and in that moment their allegiance shifted. They would follow her. Chapter 21. The Quiet Before the Dawn. The argument ended in a tense, unresolved stalemate, but the pack's choice was clear in their eyes as they helped prepare their alpha for the journey. Under the cover of a moonless, star-dusted sky, they moved through the forest. The main force, led by Gunnar, had already split off, their movements silent as ghosts as they went to draw Marcus's attention. Elena, Freya, and the healer now supported Cale, a slow, grim procession toward a fate that felt both terrifying and inevitable. The world was hushed, holding its breath. The air grew thinner, colder, as they climbed higher into the mountains. They stopped to rest in a small, sheltered grove of ancient pines. Kyle was weak, leaning heavily against Elena. For a few precious moments, they were alone, Freya and the healer having moved a short distance away to stand watch. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her with what little strength he had left. "I never told you," he said, his voice a raw, broken whisper against her hair. "The story Liam told you, about Annalise, it was a lie. All of it. There was no one else." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his golden eyes luminous and desperate in the faint light. "There has never been anyone but you. From the moment my soul recognized yours in those woods, it has only ever been you." The confession settled a final, peaceful peace into her heart. The last ghost was banished. The last of Liam's poison was gone. She reached up, her fingers gently tracing the line of his jaw. The feverish heat of his skin was a stark reminder of how little time they had. "I know," she whispered, and she realized it was true. Some deep, intuitive part of her had always known. "I think I knew from the very beginning." He closed his eyes, a look of profound, heartbreaking grief crossing his face. "I love you, Elena," he breathed, the words he'd held back for so long finally escaping. They were the most beautiful and most painful words she had ever heard. He opened his eyes, and they were shining with unshed tears. "Don't leave me." It was a complete reversal of his plea in the cage. He was no longer begging her to live without him. He was begging her to stay, even knowing the terrible price. "Never," she promised. She sealed the vow with a soft, gentle kiss. It was not a kiss of passion, but of pure, unconditional love. A kiss of promises and goodbyes, of beginnings and endings. A kiss that tasted of salt and sorrow, and a love strong enough to defy a curse. As they broke apart, a low howl echoed from the valley below. The diversion. Gunner's attack had begun. Kyle tensed, his head lifting. Ahead, through a break in the trees, they could see it, a clearing on the mountain's peak. And in the center of the clearing, a circle of tall, dark stones pointed toward the sky like the broken teeth of a long-dead god. They had arrived. Chapter 22. A Sacrifice of Blood and Moonlight. The air inside the circle of stones was dead still, humming with an ancient, unseen power. The full moon hung directly overhead, a perfect silver eye in the black sky, bathing the ancient monoliths in an ethereal glow. Marcus and Liam stood waiting by the central altar-like stone. Liam's face was a mask of cold triumph, while Marcus radiated an arrogant confidence. He had won, and he knew it. Kale, leaning on Elena and Freya, was a wounded lion, cornered but still radiating a dangerous power. "So, the broken alpha comes to his end?" Marcus called out, his voice smooth and mocking. "And he brings the sacrifice with him. How considerate." "This ends tonight, Marcus," Kale growled, his voice weak but laced with steel. "Oh, it does," Marcus agreed with a cruel smile. "But not for me." He gave Liam a sharp nod. The battle erupted with a primal fury. Freya, with a snarl of righteous hatred, launched herself at Liam. The fight between the loyal beta and the traitor was a vicious, personal whirlwind of claws and blades. At the same time, Kale, with the last of his strength, met Marcus's charge. It was a desperate, brutal struggle. Kale was wounded, his movements slower than before, driven now only by the sheer primal need to protect Elena. He was a shield, and he was cracking. While the alphas fought, the old healer guided Elena to the central altar. The stone was cold as ice beneath her hands. The healer pressed a small obsidian knife into her palm. Its edge was wickedly sharp. "It must be a choice, child," the old woman whispered, her voice trembling. "It must be freely given." Elena's gaze was locked on Kale. He took a savage blow to his wounded side and cried out, stumbling to one knee. He was losing. She knew it was time. There were no more doubts, no more fears. There was only him. Marcus stood over Kale, raising his own blade for the killing blow. "No!" Elena screamed, her voice ringing with a power that made the very stones seem to vibrate. She didn't hesitate. She sliced the obsidian knife across her own palm, a deep, clean cut. Ignoring the sting, she pressed her bleeding hand flat against the cold surface of the altar. "I offer myself," she declared to the moon, to the stones, to fate itself. "My life for his, my soul for his. Break this curse." A wave of raw, untamed energy erupted from the stone, a visible shockwave of blue-white light. It slammed into Kale, and he screamed, a raw, agonized sound as the curse writhed within him like a nest of serpents. Marcus, thrown back by the blast, just laughed. "It's not enough," He roared over the din. "The price must be paid in full. You have to die." Cale struggled back to his feet, his eyes wild with terror and a love so fierce it was a physical force. "Don't!" he bellowed at her. The power flared, but the curse, the ancient hatred, held on. It wasn't enough. Elena looked at Kyle, her heart overflowing with a love so complete it left no room for fear. She walked toward him, moving past a stunned Marcus as if he wasn't even there. "You were wrong," she told Cale, her voice a soft, intimate whisper in the heart of the storm. "Love isn't meant to be safe. It's meant to be a choice." She stopped in front of him, her back to their enemy, and tilted her head, exposing the soft, vulnerable curve of her neck. Her eyes never left his. "So, claim me anyway." It was not a plea. It was a command. An act of ultimate faith, an act of total surrender. For one eternal second, he hesitated, his face a mask of unbearable agony. Love and torment warred in his golden eyes. Then, with a cry that was half a sob and half a triumphant roar, he lunged. His fangs, sharp and final, sank into her flesh. The world, the moon, the pain, the love. It all exploded in a silent, blinding flash of pure white light. Chapter 23. The Dawn After the Dark. The white light faded, leaving behind the scent of rain on hot stone and a profound, ringing silence. Elena's first sensation was the cool earth beneath her cheek. She was alive. She pushed herself up slowly, her body weak and trembling but whole. Her hand went to her neck. There was no gaping wound. Instead, her fingers traced a delicate, intricate pattern on her skin where he had bitten her. It wasn't a scar. It was a mark. And it tingled with a strange, warm, humming energy that seemed to connect directly to her heart. The old healer was kneeling beside her, her ancient eyes wide with a look of pure, unadulterated awe. "It was never about death," the woman whispered, her voice full of wonder. Marcus was a fool. He only read the witch's words of hatred. The curse was forged from betrayal. It could only be undone by its perfect opposite. She looked at the mark on Elena's neck. Absolute, selfless trust, the willingness to die, not the death itself. Your offering on the altar, and your surrender to him. Together, it was an act of pure, untainted love. You didn't just break the curse, you erased it. Elena's gaze flew across the clearing. Cale lay collapsed a few feet away, utterly still. But he was different. The dark, poisonous veins that had marred his skin were gone. The lines of constant, weary torment had been smoothed from his face. He looked peaceful, young, free. In the aftermath of the blast, Marcus and Liam lay unconscious, thrown against the standing stones. Freya, bruised but alive, stood over the traitor, her expression grim. The threat was over. As if on cue, Gunnar and the rest of the pack emerged from the trees, having won their diversionary battle, their eyes taking in the impossible scene. But Elena only had eyes for Cale. She crawled over to him, her heart overflowing with a relief so immense it felt like its own kind of pain. She reached out a trembling hand and touched his face. He was warm. He was breathing. He stirred at her touch, his eyelids fluttering open. The gold was still there, but it was clear and calm as a summer sunset, no longer haunted by torment. He saw her, alive, whole. A choked sound escaped his lips. He reached up, his hand shaking and his fingertips ghosted over the new mark on her neck. "You're alive," he breathed, his voice thick with a raw, disbelieving emotion. A single tear traced a path from the corner of his eye. I can't feel it anymore. The curse. It's gone." He looked at her, his expression one of pure, unadulterated wonder. "I'm free." No other words were needed. She collapsed against his chest, and his arms came around her, holding her with a strength that was no longer desperate, but sure and steady. They clung to each other amidst the ancient stones and the profound silence as the first, hopeful rays of dawn crested the mountain peak, washing the world in pale, clean, forgiving light. It was the dawn of a new life, earned through sacrifice and paid for with a love that had proven stronger than any curse. Chapter 24. The Alpha and His Luna. A month later, the fortress was no longer a prison, but a home. The heavy, oppressive silence that had once filled its halls had been replaced by the easy sounds of a pack healing. There were murmurs of conversation in the hallways, the occasional burst of laughter from the training grounds, the scent of baking bread from the kitchens. The light seemed to find its way into corners that had been dark for years. The curse was broken, and with it, the long winter in Cale's soul had finally thawed. He was a different man. The weight he had carried his entire life was gone, and in its place was a quiet, confident strength that his pack responded to with a fierce, renewed loyalty. He smiled now, a real smile that reached his clear, golden eyes. He led them not with the torment of a cursed king, but with the steady hand of a true alpha who had found his center. And Elena was that center. She was no longer the outsider, the liability, the prisoner. She was the Luna. The pack treated her with a reverence that still surprised her, their gratitude a warm and constant presence. She had found a family in this wild, unlikely place. She had found a sense of belonging she had never known she was missing. Tonight, she stood on a stone balcony off the main hall, looking out at the vast, moonlit forest. The woods were no longer a place of fear, but a kingdom of breathtaking beauty. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind, pulling her back against a warm, solid chest. Kyle. His touch was no longer hesitant or tinged with the fear of his own power. It was sure. It was loving. It was possessive in a way that made her feel cherished, not owned. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his lips brushing against her temple. She leaned back into him, her hand coming up to rest over his. "I was thinking about the woman who first drove up to that cabin a few months ago," she said softly. She was so broken. She believed love was a trap. She thought freedom meant being completely alone. He turned her in his arms, his golden eyes glowing with a soft, steady light under the moon. "And now?" he asked. Elena reached up, her fingers tracing the faint, silvery mark on her neck that mirrored a similar one on his shoulder. It was the symbol of their bond, a beautiful scar of their victory. "Now," she whispered, her gaze locked with his. "I know freedom isn't about being alone. It's about finding what you're willing to fight for." A slow smile spread across her face. "It's about choosing your bond, and I choose you, Kale. Every time." He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't the desperate, hungry kiss of the storm, nor the heartbreaking kiss of goodbye. It was a kiss of promises, of forevers, of a love that had been tested in the darkest of fires and had emerged unbreakable. Later, as they stood wrapped in each other's arms, a sound echoed up from the valley below. A single clear howl, full of strength and pride. Without a moment's hesitation, another howl answered it from the balcony, a harmonious note that joined the first. The song of the Alpha and his Luna, no longer a cry of loneliness, but a declaration of triumph, of love, and of being finally completely home.